Hello, this is David Scheinbaum of Scheinbaum and Russick, and I recreated this lecture for you today as part of our ongoing series of blogs and PowerPoints and videos. It was originally delivered, as you can see from this slide, in 2003 at a SPE conference, but it was also on the occasion of the opening at the Orlando Museum of Art of the Eliot Porter Retrospective Exhibition, which was being traveled by the Amon Carter Museum. I hope you look into our blogs on our website, which is photographydealers.com, or on our YouTube channel, which is Scheinbaum and Russick. There's over a year of examples there, and actually there's a number of blogs of giving you background information on Eliot Porter specifically that might help enlighten you for today's lecture. Also, if you hear some papers rattling, I don't usually use notes when I do this, but there's so many quotes in this talk that if you hear some papers rattling, you'll know I'm turning pages. It's hard to begin to talk about Eliot without talking about the intersection between art and science. This Leonardo da Vinci quote, I think, says it all. And I like to remind my students that Johann Heinrich Schultz in 1727 had discovered the light sensitivity of silver salts. Yet photography itself wasn't discovered until pretty much 1839 or the late 1820s, depending on whose histories you follow. But, if there's more of a dialogue between the scientific community and artistic community, I think we'd make even greater jumps in technology, especially in our art form of photography. And as Leonardo says, to not be aware of the scientific aspects of our medium is literally like sailing without rudder or compass. Eliot kind of epitomizes this intersection of science and art. His life basically had one foot in each branch. And, as we'll see in this talk, that intersection keeps crossing at different times during his career. Again, if you've read our blogs, you've heard the stories of how Janet and I, started Scheinbaum and Russick, and how we came to have the honor of working with the likes of Beaumont, Newhall, and Eliot Porter. But rather than go over it all again here today, I would just say that, I was assisting Beaumont, and one of the tasks I did for Beaumont was I was doing his black and white printing. And Eliot, I guess, needed some assistance at one point and called Beaumont, and Beaumont suggested that I, go out and see if I could also help with Eliot. And I couldn't. I was teaching full time at the College of Santa Fe. Janet and I had just begun Scheinbaum and Russick. I was working with Beaumont with most of my free time. So So Beaumont suggested that Janet go out, and of course Janet became Eliot's longtime assistant. And I'll talk about more of that in today's talk. But it's really, our relationships with Beaumont and Eliot that kind of formed our professional life, not only as art dealers, but maybe more specifically, and I know it's true for both of us, in our own artwork, in our own photography. The things that we learned from both those men, I think we're still distilling in our work, and still figuring out all of the many lessons that we have learned. What a great honor it was for us. When I produced a BISTI portfolio of my work in 1987, I had asked if Eliot would write an introduction to the portfolio. And this is a little excerpt from his introduction. Again, it's thinking about science and art. It's thinking about what's required in terms of not only your technical skills, but your emotional skills. I'm still blown away every time I read this excerpt from this introduction that he wrote for me. For Eliot, life and art were inseparable. He worked every day. I mean, his typical day, his mornings, he'd go in the darkroom. He would either be making color separations or matrices, or printing dye transfer. His basically mornings were spent in the darkroom. Lunch was generally at the same time every day, and almost the same lunch every day. Afternoons were spent in the office, in his studio. I'll be able to show you these buildings and these processes later in the lecture. But Eliot's life was just that. It was working all the time. I remember sometimes on Friday he would say, "Oh, it's the weekend," and Janet couldn't come out on Saturdays or Sundays because of family responsibilities and other work, and it would kind of slow him down. He just, if it was up to him, I think he would just basically work 7 days a week, and if his energy was permitting, he would work 24/7. It's kind of amazing to realize that Eliot was in his 60s when his first book was published, in Wildness is the Preservation of the World. This was published in 1963. Now, from being in his 60s until his death in 1990, more than 30 other books were published. But for those of you who are photographers who are kind of anxious about when you're going to get your first show, when you're going to get your first book published, and imagine, Eliot was someone who worked every day, doing his photography every day, photographing, darkroom, correspondence, organizing his prints, working on trips, working on books. Yet, really, it was not until he was in his 60s that his first book was published. That's kind of perseverance is I think, in a way, unknown today. A lot of people wouldn't wait. Now, a lot of that had to do with the fact that color photography, wasn't accepted so widely as part of the art form of photography. This book happened really, in a way, again, back to the Newhalls, through the efforts of Beaumont, but mostly Nancy Newhall. There was an exhibition of Eliot's work at Eastman House, and Nancy, after seeing the work, basically got on the phone and arranged for the publication of this book. So he was in his 60s. Then to realize he was in his 70s when he did this work in Antarctica. And actually, the first trip, I think he tripped on one of the ships and separated his shoulder and had to come back home for surgery and then went back. So he had 2 trips to Antarctica while he was in his 70s doing this amazing work, which still, there's a number of photographers who have worked in Antarctica, and I still think Eliot's photographs stand alone. And then to realize he was in his 80s when he did this wonderful work in China with his son, Jonathan Porter. This book, All Under Heaven, is a beautiful record of life of the people in China and the landscape in China. So, it doesn't end. There's no retirement age, in the work of an artist. And if we're looking for inspiration in photography, we don't have to look any further than looking at the work of Eliot Porter. For me, working with Eliot has given me new perspectives on photography, of course, but also on life and aging. Again, he was a constant inspiration. And it's worth repeating again, color photography, not being in vogue for much of Eliot's career. He worked in isolation. He didn't get a lot of the kudos a lot of photographers get when they have shows, when they have books published. Color was not in the mainstream. Black and white, for many years, was the definition of artistic photography. As Ansel was known to say, the most expressive photograph is a black and white photograph in which we could feel the color. Now, of course, Eliot didn't buy into that, and he believed what needed to be photographed in color should have been photographed in color, and what needed to be photographed in black and white was photographed in black and white. And for Eliot, although he is considered the father of color photography, he has a whole life's work in black and white as well. This is a 1938 photograph from Penobscot Bay. And again, when Eliot looked at his subject, it was a decision. There are some subjects which he photographed both in black and white and color, but for the most part, the work in black and white stands that in as gelatin silver prints, and the work in color stands as dye transfer prints. Eliot continued to work in black and white, not as much later on, but he worked in black and white till 1972. I mean, there's one or two examples of some really later black and white prints. For the most part, though, the black and white work goes through the 1940s. Again, keeping in mind that it's the photographer's job to interpret reality, really not to record it. So the film you use, the tools you use, including cameras and exposure meters, and again, the medium, that all is something that the photographer needs to figure out and calculate as they're beginning to work and to photograph a subject. Now, Eliot's introduction to the art of photography kind of came a little later. He was trained in medicine, as I think many of you probably know, but photography was always his passion. His brother, Fairfield Porter, one of the great American painters and an American art critic, was kind of in the circle of Alfred Stieglitz. So he had a lot of connections and knew a lot of people, and it was actually through Fairfield Porter that Eliot was invited to a dinner at some friends, and he was asked to bring some of his photographs, that there was going to be another photographer there. And so after dinner, Eliot took out his photographs and showed a number of those prints to the group, and everybody kind of, nodded their head and said some nice things. And then the other photographer took out his portfolio. And Eliot was shocked. He was deeply embarrassed, actually. He had never seen such well-crafted photographs. The prints were luminous and stunning, and it was clear that these prints were superior to his. Not just technically, but emotionally as well. Well, that impact never kind of left Eliot, and it changed everything about his working methodology. You might have guessed that other photographer who was at that dinner was Ansel Adams. And Ansel very politely said to Eliot that maybe it was time for him to use a larger camera. The images he was showing that evening were done with a Leica 35 millimeter camera, and a lot of the images were landscapes, which is really not the best subject matter for such a small format. So from then on, Eliot really did switch to 8x10 and started working larger. And it was just a few years later that, also through Fairfield Porter, that Eliot met Alfred Stieglitz and started to meet with him, show him his work, and get some feedback from Stieglitz. And it's funny because Eliot used to tell us a story that Stieglitz also, when looking at his early work, said they were kind of woolly. And that word woolly may not have meaning to a lot of you today as collectors or photographers, but that word woolly is what we might call a veil, like on a black and white print. It's kind of not, it's not really a question of resolution or grain. It's just a question of a little veil over the print that kind of, imagine looking through a slight scrim or curtain, that the sharpness and the tonality and the luminosity isn't really popping off the paper. And again, it was a comment directly related to format. So early on, Eliot, his black and white work was primarily done 8 by 10. His color work was primarily done with 4 by 5. Now there are exceptions to both the color and black and white in terms of format, but that was his main working methodology. And of course, a few years later, Alfred Stieglitz, upon one of Eliot's visits, has told him, "You have arrived," and offered Eliot an exhibition. And that exhibition was the very last show of An American Place in January 1939. But during that show, actually, the last 4 slides I showed you were all in that show, and they were all purchased by a photography supporter, a man named David McAlpin. And David McAlpin is a name some of you might know, but he was the person who put up the original seed money at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for their photography collecting program. And he also put up the seed money for the new photography program at the Museum of Modern Art, which Beaumont Newhall was going to head up. So he was a great supporter of photography. He was a real patron of Eliot's for the rest of his life, and he was a frequent visitor to Stieglitz's gallery. And during that show, this letter, and this is an excerpt from the letter that Stieglitz wrote to him, and this notion that Eliot's prints offered Stieglitz the sense of his own spirit, inspired Janet and I and Eliot to produce this portfolio of the earliest of Eliot's black and white work, this portfolio entitled There Is My Own Spirit. And I think you could probably see the whole portfolio on our website, which is photographydealers.com. So Eliot, after that show at Stieglitz's gallery, he was basically had to make the decision between medicine and photography. And of course, we know he chose photography. His life in photography permitted him to not only continue, working in the natural world, but also pioneering black and white and color and the dye transfer process. I'll give you a quick look at just a selection of some black and white work. And again, these are pieces that were in that Amon Carter retrospective exhibition, which is why the selection is what it is. But Stieglitz, really gave Eliot a boost. And after that, soon after that, Eliot and his wife Eileen came out to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where Eileen Porter's brother was living. Eileen herself was a visual artist, primarily a painter and a box maker. Her brother was an inventor. His name was Peter Killam, and actually he invented the hummingbird feeder that probably many of you have hanging outside your windows, actually this time of year, being late April. Anyway, after that first visit to Santa Fe, Eliot and Eileen decided to come and move here. And certainly by 1940, Eliot came to New Mexico with Eileen, and he began photographing really seriously throughout the whole state. Many of these images, as I said, are 8 by 10 or 8 by 10 contact prints. Eliot's technique in black and white was no surprise, but right out of Ansell's teachings. Those of you who are familiar with Ansel Adams' books, the photography series, the books, it's, one volume is the negative, one is the print, one is light and film, one is Polaroid photography. That series of books outlines, setting up a darkroom, photographic chemistry, creating your own developing formulas, and, the process of making fine prints. And Eliot used those books, and he followed them. So he was a follower of the zone system. Eliot's really thankful that that was so clearly laid out by Ansel, and it really kind of set a framework too for Eliot's approach to photography in terms of exposure, development, and printing. Again, those of you who know the state, he worked from the Colorado border down to the Mexican border. A lot of the small towns, a lot of this work ended up being published in a book called Eliot Porter Southwest, which I will be discussing later at the end of this talk. Those of you who know this Santuario de Chimayo, those beautiful cottonwood trees are now gone, but it's still a place. I think not every, but many major photographers from the 20th century made the pilgrimage to New Mexico and photographed the Santuario. Edward Weston, Ansel, I don't know. You could go on and on and on and name all the people who have images of the Ranchos de Taos Church in Taos, and the Santuario de Chimayo in Chimayo, and the cross on the church in Las Trampas. There are certain iconic photographic subject matters throughout New Mexico that even if you've never been here, they're very familiar to you. Well, with the success of the Stieglitz show and Eliot's career, his passion since a child was photographing birds. He loved birds. He knew so much about them, photographing them in their nests from the day of their hatch and following them in flight in their various environments. He just, was the man who photographed, all these birds, and it made sense that he tried to use, this as an opportunity to get his bird work published. So he went to, I think it was E.P. Dutton, and thought he could get his bird images published. And I have a quote here. The publisher, his name was Paul Brooks at the time, and he was the editor-in-chief. And he explained that although these bird photographs are strong, one could not identify their species without their color, because we need to tell their markings. Well, that kind of rejection had all to do with Eliot turning to color photography. And he literally went back and rephotographed his life's work up to that point in color. Now, the rest of the story there is that when he went back to get his, appointment and show all his new bird work all in color, he again had a meeting with Dutton to have that book published. And he was told, again, these images are very strong, but it's much too expensive to publish a book in color. So it still hadn't been published then. But finally, by 1972, we see the publication of Eliot's first book of birds, Birds of North America, and subsequently there are a number of other bird books of Eliot's work. Now, the bird work, in a way, stands, a lot of photographers who collect Eliot's work are not even aware of the bird photographs. And then a lot of the kind of bird people who are very aware of Eliot's bird photographs are not aware of the rest of his work. But truth is, at this point in time, being 2021, I think most people are aware of, all of the work that encompasses Eliot's career. In the 50s, Eliot took a trip with a photographer friend named Ellen Auerbach and went and photographed the churches and a lot of iconography of Mexico. This trip, was opened up a new subject matter for Eliot. He was not a particularly religious man. In fact, he wasn't religious at all. He was very scientific about his beliefs. But Janet discovered this Mexican work and while cataloging Eliot's work. Now, I should say, rediscovered. Eliot knew it was there, and I guess maybe a handful of people knew it was there. But for the most part, no one had ever seen it. And Janet suggested to Eliot, maybe we should, show this work and work on a publication of it. And, like Eliot, would often say, oh, I don't know if there was interest in this work. I'm not sure. But, Janet just needed to make one or two phone calls. And this beautiful University of New Mexico Press publication was done in 1987, which is, the book of the Eliot Porter and Ellen Auerbach's photographs of Mexico. And subsequently, a few years later, another publication was made called Mexican Celebrations. But we really have Janet to thank, actually, for getting, this work out into the public's eye. Eliot's life, I didn't mention this a few minutes earlier, but Eliot and Eileen lived in New Mexico in the early 40s, but then during the war years, they went back east, and kind of Eliot's service during the war was working at MIT in the radiation lab and doing research. But by 1945, they moved back to New Mexico and pretty much lived here for the rest of their lives. But every summer was spent on the family island, which is entitled Great Spruce Head Island. So, for the family, Eliot's father had purchased that island when he was young, and Eliot and his brothers and their children and other family members continue to habitate the Great Spruce Head Island. But I would say, with a very few exceptions, Eliot spent every summer of his life on Great Spruce Head Island, and it was a place where a lot of his photographs were made, both in black and white and color. And the work in Glen Canyon, you might be familiar with it, but there's a book entitled The Place No One Knew. Eliot worked relentlessly to try to save areas through photographing them and kind of showing the world the beauty that's hidden within these canyons, within these places, within these areas. And really, in unfortunately, in too many cases, Eliot's work is kind of the only record we have. This area I'm showing you right now is now underneath Lake Powell. Trees, again, working in color versus black and white. Again, if you think of this image as a black and white image, it wouldn't work really. The tonality would probably translate in very close proximity to each other. I don't know if you would get through that foreground of brush to get to that tree in the background. Eliot was very aware of tonality and how to not only use tonality in black and white, but also how to, use tonality in color. And, when we think of Eliot, we think of this incredible range of color. How many shades of green? How many shades of blue? How many, it's not just photographing, big, bright, colorful things. It's really in the subtlety of working in color that Eliot's work thrives, being able to almost see the unseen, what color permits us to see by getting through certain areas and let the color kind of express the subject matter. Well, I'll spend a few minutes now to talk about color. We could actually take a small visit to Eliot. Of course, I made these images years ago, and I made many, but I edited them down. I try to give you a sense of where Eliot lived and how Eliot worked. This was the entrance, if you drove down Eliot's Road, in a little town north of Santa Fe, called Tasuki, New Mexico. Um, Very, you know, unassuming road. You would not know, who lived there, but if you drove down this road, you'd eventually get to this sign. And that kind of welcomed you to Eliot and Eileen's home. As you entered, there's some sculptures around. One of Eliot's sons, Stephen Porter, is a noted sculptor, and his beautiful wooden sculptures kind of graced the landscape and kind of fit in a very natural way. Um, Janet and I are very privileged to have this sculpture on our property today. It was gifted to Janet after Eliot's death. And this is Eileen Porter in the yard, but I'm just trying to give you a sense. You drive down this little dirt road and you kind of get to this paradise. The home inside and out was a work of art. The colors, the tones, it was so beautifully organized. It was really like arriving at an oasis in the desert. Uh, this is the place where Eliot spent, as I kind of implied earlier, most of his time. This is Eliot's studio building. The door on the left was the entrance to Eliot's darkroom, and the door on the right was the entrance to Eliot's studio. And as I said, in the mornings, we'd go in the left door. In the afternoons, you'd go in the right door. Of course, if you look at this carefully, you'll see, actually, this was taken toward the end of Eliot's life, and you'll see the electric wheelchair that's sitting out there. We'll talk maybe a little more about that in a few minutes. But once you enter the studio, which is the right door, it's Eliot's desk. That Tamariva photograph above Eliot's desk was always there all the years we knew of Eliot, and I think I have a slide of it I'll show you later. And you could see, it does not look like my desk. His desk was pretty organized with the tasks at hand, what needs to be done. I kind of didn't realize it at the time, but that photograph leaning there by the telephone is one of Janet's photographs of our son Zachary, right when he was born. To our kids, Eliot Porter and Beaumont were a family. They were like uncles. They were very much a part of our lives, and the kids knew them in some ways better than other relatives, because most of our relatives lived in the East. So in terms of elders and kind of grandparent figures, both Beaumont and Eliot and their families, in a way, had that place. Eliot was also an incredible craftsman, carpentry, woodworker. This desk you see is made of cherry wood. Eliot built it. In fact, pretty much all the furniture in Eliot's studio was made by him. Incredible craftsmanship, beautiful use of woods, beautiful functionality. He was an amazing designer, an amazing builder, and had a beautiful wood shop. Actually, on the other side, there was another building next to that studio picture I showed you that contained his wood shop. Eliot was an ardent supporter of civil rights, of environmental rights, of human rights, and he had these posters hanging, books hanging. He didn't hesitate to write letters to the editor, to write letters to congressmen, senators, presidents, expressing his points of view. He was an ardent believer, of course, in conservation, and he always tried to let his politics be known, both artistically and through his efforts and works of art themselves. And, again, every box was labeled with a scientific name of the bird, not just its common name. And you'd go into the box, and again, their catalog, where they were photographed, when they were photographed, their scientific names, their common names, the season that they were photographed in. I mean, it's amazing cataloging. Eliot was so, careful about everything. This is Janet stamping. After a print was made, it was then dry mounted. Verticals were dry mounted one size, horizontals were dry mounted another size. That never varied. And then every print was stamped on the back with Eliot Studio stamp. And I don't know if you could see it in this slide, but in that little piece of cardboard was their template. I mean, it's not just every print is stamped on the back, but every print is stamped in the same place on the back, because Eliot even created this little cardboard cutout so the placement of the stamps would not vary. As I said, the boxes are labeled. These are boxes containing work from China. When you pull the box and opened it, there's one of Janet's slips of paper with the number of every print that was in that box, the order it was in that box, and how it corresponded to whether it was published or not. And then, of course, it contained Eliot's title, the date the images were made, and the negative number. And Eliot had his own system for numbering transparencies, numbering prints. So if he needed to reprint, by looking at the number on the back of the print, he was able to amazingly quickly find the negative and the matrices to reprint that. And I don't know how many of you listening are photographers, but I can't tell you how long sometimes I spent looking for negatives for a print that I want to remake. I think I'm fairly organized, but it still would take me probably an hour longer than it would take Eliot and Janet to find one of his transparencies, which actually never took more than a few minutes. Speaking of his transparencies, his transparencies and matrices, everything was kept in this separate building. And this building was what we called cold storage. It was unheated, cold adobe building, so it was beautifully insulated, cool in the summer, a little warmer in the winter. And inside that building, we would see, Eliot's, the back wall. Those are 35 millimeter slides. And this whole section of file cabinets on the right contain Eliot's transparencies. And as I said earlier, primarily the transparencies are made in 4x5. And again, as I said, the back of every print had a number on it. And these drawers were structured in a way that, they're chronologically. So it really took minutes to find the original transparency, and if needed, the color separations for Eliot to make one of his prints. It was impeccably organized. We're talking about tens of thousands of transparencies. And the other side of that cabinet unit contained the matrices. And it's those matrices that are used to make Eliot's dye transfer prints. I will try again, if I photographed every single step of the way, from beginning to end. The making a dye transfer print basically could take 3 days because of all of the darkroom work involved. But I'm going to try to quickly take you through how Eliot was making dye transfer prints, and let's see if that helps. First of all, this is his enlarger in his darkroom. Starting with a 4x5 transparency, that transparency is put into the enlarger, and what's made is what we call color separations. And color separations are basically like making a black and white negative of each of the ranges of color in the original transparency. So imagine, you're looking at a full color transparency, and then in the enlarger, first you're printing it through a red filter onto another piece of film. And then you develop that piece of film, and on that you have an image of just the reds from that original picture. Then you print it again through a green filter, and you develop that piece of film, and now you have a separation showing the green section and then blue. So by printing through the different filtration, you're actually separating out the color of the original transparency onto three other pieces of film. And in this case, you're starting with a color transparency, but now you've just exposed and developed three black and white pieces of film. So once those are developed in total darkness and then dried, you go back into the enlarger, and one by one, you print those, what we call color separations, onto another sheet of film, which is going to be the size of the print you're going to make. And this film is called matrix film. And matrix film is again, it looks like black and white film, but it has a thicker emulsion. And again, you'll see in a few minutes that emulsion permits those pieces of matrix film to absorb the dyes and then release those dyes onto a piece of paper. So when I say the process could take 3 days, 2 of the days are spent, starting with your original transparency, making your color separations, which is exposing and developing black and white film, then going back into the enlarger, making 3 different matrices, one for cyan, one for magenta, and one for yellow. So you're basically exposing and developing black and white film for a couple of days until you get everything ready to print. The printing itself is going to be done in the daylight, but again, not after spending, 2 days in total darkness. Here, you'll see, this Eliot's darkroom sink, and then we kind of go out into the printing room, and you see those bottles of dye there. And I think now maybe I could kind of walk you through the printing process. And again, it's not every single step, but it's a number of steps. You have your dye baths. You use these graduates. You put them all into solution of various, not only various dilutions, determining the strength of, how strong the dyes will be, but there's also a way to increase or decrease the acidity of these dye baths, which has all to do with the effect of the contrast of your prints. This is a man named Bob Whitcomb, who at the end of Eliot's life, as I said, he had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He was no longer able to use his body, basically. And Bob was trained by Eliot to assist him in printing. So you'll see in the sink, there's those first 3 trays. One's blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow. Then there's a rinse bath. Then there's other trays in the back are also to condition the paper and get ready for printing. Now, I should have mentioned that from the very beginning of the process of putting that transparency in the enlarger, making those color separation, and making those matrices, everything is punched with various series of holes. We call this for pin registration. So by putting the film into like this hole puncher and then exposing it and then developing it, all the way through, everything stays in registration. Those of you who know what I'm talking about, this is called pin registration. There was a time where Eliot actually printed without that, and he printed by eye. But the wonderful thing about Eliot's dye transfer prints is how perfectly they're all registered. So what you'll see in a moment is that to make a print, we actually have to have 3 different printings, one of the cyan, one of the magenta, one of the yellow. And because you're constantly removing each matrix and putting another one on, everything has to remain in perfect registration, or else you'll lose sharpness. It will get kind of very fuzzy looking. Here's Bob taking a piece of paper, putting it down on the registration board, sponging off the excess water, and then getting ready to put down the cyan matrix. So first, since, as I said, it has holes in it, so you attach those holes into those clips, and this we refer to as rolling a print. And the reason referred to it as rolling a print is because you're literally going to roll that matrix down onto the paper. Now that matrix was soaking in the cyan dye, in the blue dye. So as it's rolled down, it's basically putting pressure on it and getting it to be in perfect contact with the paper. We let it sit. And while it's sitting, and here it is, folks, the dye is transferring to the paper. So we have this dye transfer. The cyan dye is now being transferred to the paper. So from that sponge-like emulsion on that matrix film, the paper itself is now absorbing all of the dye that was on that matrix. Now this takes some minutes, so while this is happening, Bob will go back and begin soaking the magenta matrix. And while that magenta matrix is soaking in that red dye bath, he'll make sure it's getting completely covered by agitating it in the bath. He'll take that magenta matrix out and let it drip. And then let's assume he took off the cyan already, and you'll see that all of that cyan has transferred. And now we're getting ready to put the magenta matrix on. He's going to put it into those clips because the holes are punched, and we'll roll out that magenta matrix, and again the magenta dye will transfer there. Now in the dye transfer process, when all 3 colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow, are transferred, where they all overlap, that's how we get black. Where none of them transfer, that's how we're able to remain white. So we're able to produce a print with those 3 colors. We're able to produce a full color print. Black is achieved, as I said, by the overlap of the colors, and white is achieved just from the white of the paper. And again, while the transfer is taking place, this is what the print looks like. This is just with those 2. This is just cyan and magenta. And while that's transferring, you'll see in this washer that the first matrix is being washed, because these can be reused. As many prints as one wants. They don't wear out, and because they're basically black and white, they don't fade. They have a much longer life than color, which is actually one of the reasons that Eliot was so excited about using the dye transfer process. For one, you were able to make more than one print. Earlier color processes, Carbro and some others, as much as you could make a color print, your results to reproduce from print to print were not always assumable. They were affected by the humidity of the room, by how wet they were. There's so many environmental variables that if you made one perfect print, there was no guarantee the next print would look exactly the same. With dye transfer, because you're using pieces of film, you could guarantee your results from print to print. And the other great advantage of the dye transfer process is that because they're on black and white materials, they're permanent. So if the print, now dye transfer prints have a life of like 100 years, but if there was ever a change of color of the dye transfer print, in Eliot's case, he was able to go back and make another print, or if a print got damaged, or if he sold a print and needed to make another one, he was able to follow his notes and make another print. So the permanence of using these black and white materials to generate the print was something that was very attractive to Eliot, plus the reproducibility of the prints was very attractive to Eliot. And the other thing was control. You can imagine, after Eliot made a final print, let's say he wanted the blue to be deeper, and he wanted to make a different interpretation. Then he would just have to go back, make a new color separation, make a new cyan matrix with a little more density, with a little more exposure, and the next time when he made the printing, the transfer would transfer more blue. So it gave him control over each of the color ranges without spilling over. So the yellow doesn't go green, and you don't get muddy colors. You get really beautiful three-dimensional prints with incredible clarity of color. Anyway, back to this slide, you'll see that the cyan matrix is washing. Bob is making sure all the dye has been washed off. He'll hang it up to dry, and he'll go back and replenish those first two dye baths. And again, after every print, you kind of, these are very strong solutions of those dyes. You'll see Bob go back and he'll kind of replenish a little more, magenta in the magenta, a little more cyan and cyan, just to keep each dye bath at the proper strength. Coming now to the yellow, taking it out of the pre-wash, soaking it in the dye bath, and here Bob is getting ready. It's clipped and he's rolling on the yellow matrix. And as the yellow matrix is sitting there, you begin to see the print. And there it is. You take that matrix off and you have your full color print. Now after that print is made, it gets blotted in these blotters, and knowing Eliot, everything's written down. The strength of those dye baths, how they were replenished, how old they were, the date, the printing, the acidity of those baths. Basically, everything is written on those cards. So for every single print, if you think back to those boxes of Eliot's prints, every single print that was ever made has a card with how Eliot printed it. So if he had to go back years later to make another print, he could pretty much make it following his own notes. These are kind of older drying racks, and there we have it. Now, for me, I mentioned earlier that Eliot's dye transfer prints were his masterwork. And some people think he invented color photography. He didn't. Kodak actually developed dye transfer for the advertising industry because of its ability to saturate. If you were doing an advertising coffee can, imagine making that coffee can really bright and red. So the dye transfer process was developed for Madison Avenue, where they were able to make prints with very high saturations. And Eliot didn't invent it, but he was the person that adapted it to artistic photography, to fine art photography. But again, his black and white work was never lost. And again, we have Janet to thank. In her cataloging, again, she didn't discover the black and white work, but she rediscovered the black and white work. During the years that Janet was working with Eliot hadn't shown or thought much about that black and white work for years. And it is indeed amazing, amazing work. So Janet again and Eliot, made a phone call, and it resulted in the publication of this beautiful book, Eliot Porter Southwest. So Eliot was, at this time, was still printing and exposing dye transfer, and I just showed you his darkroom. It was not set up to print black and white in any way, although Eliot himself was a master black and white printer. But probably because Janet worked for Eliot, and probably because I printed for Beaumont, Eliot and Janet asked me if I would make the prints for this publication. Um, it was an incredible honor but an incredible task. And from 1982 to 1985, I made those prints for this publication. I basically had to make about 100 prints, and we made 4 of each. Eliot wanted a whole set to go into his archive. He wanted a set, of course, that had to go to the publisher. And then we made 2 sets for inventory, basically, if there was interest in prints being purchased. Printing for Eliot was an incredible task. I thought I knew how to print. Other people thought I knew how to print. But, every one of Eliot's envelopes had the formula he used to make that print from that negative. So once the selection of those prints were made, I was given all these negative envelopes and, expecting to just see a title and a date and information about the negative. There was literally a formula to create a developer. And believe it or not, Eliot made a different developer formula for pretty much every single photograph. Depending on the tones, depending on the highlights, depending on the mid-range, Eliot modified his developer. And I had not had much experience making my own formulas yet at this time. So this put me into a realm of photography I don't think I ever would have entered if it wasn't for Eliot. Not to mention that the papers that Eliot printed on were no longer available. So needing to learn chemistry, needing to learn formulas, needing to learn how to make papers bend to my whims. It did take 3 years to make these 100 prints. There were 3 incredibly difficult years, but also 3 years in which I probably learned more about photography than all my previous years combined. In some cases, there was a master print, where I was able to have one of Eliot's prints to match it. In other cases, I would be making these daily trips out to Eliot's studio, showing him my print, watching him rip it up, and sending me back to the darkroom again and again and again until I got it right. Of course, I never knew what right was in many cases because I had no print to look at. So I have to say, as frustrating as some of those years were, it was an amazing honor, and I learned more than I don't think I could have learned any other way. It really was fantastic. Here's that Tamariva photograph that Eliot always had hanging over his desk. It was a favorite of his. It was not far from Georgia O'Keeffe's home. Of course, Eliot and O'Keeffe were friends, going back to the days of his show at Stieglitz's gallery. And again, thinking about these slides. Not only are these slides, but now they're being reproduced on this PowerPoint, so you can't really see. But working with blacks, working with whites. Eliot had, one of the first times I bought a print, out to Eliot, black and white print, he'd say, it's too green. I was never really referring to black and white prints as having a color, too green, too blue, too red. But a lot of it had to do with my eyes. I used to tell my students, imagine a musician, going to a concert. And, if I go to a concert, live music, I usually, I'm euphoric just listening and watching the musicians. And inevitably, I'd meet someone in the lobby and they'd say, well, the violin was a little off, it's like, I didn't hear it. It sounded fine to me. It's kind of the same with printing. I'd look at a print, it'd look fine. I go to Eliot and he'd go, no, it's too green. I say, green? And it took a while, as a musician's ear is attuned to hearing the subtlety of the notes. Eliot's eyes were attuned to see the subtle hues of the print. And certainly the black and white print has to have a clarity of black and white. And you don't want to reference color unless, of course, you do. And, that would be an interpretive decision on your part. So a lot of printing for Eliot was really learning to see for the first time, not just warm tones and cold tones, but really learning to see. I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this lecture about Stieglitz referencing this woolliness to prints. Prints, black and white prints often do have a veil. And learning how to remove that veil and get to the clarity of the print was something that, you only learn by constant and persistent seeing, by looking and looking and looking until you see the subtlety. Paul Caponegro wrote a marvelous essay called The Voice of the Print, in which he also talks about this notion of the emotional content and the clarity of the photographic print. It's kind of a realm of photography that a lot of photographers, don't get to experience, especially now. And again, I'm not bashing digital technologies in any way, but working digitally on a computer screen and with a digital printer, you're not as hands-on as you are, with your hands in the chemistry and, making print after print after print and subtly adding a little hydroquinone or a little potassium bromide or some other chemical or glycine, just putting a pinch of glycine into that developing bath and watch that tonality of that print totally come to life. These are things that, you only gain, through the experience. So it was great for me. It was amazing. Of course, it was great. But basically, it was Janet who, she and Eliot had this remarkable relationship. A lot of it had to do is that she didn't really want to work in the darkroom with him. So many of his assistants before him wanted to learn dye transfer, and Eliot would lament, by the time they were really able to be of help to him after training them and teaching them dye transfer, and he understood this, they'd want to leave and do their own work. They wouldn't want to stay around and print for him. But since Janet didn't really want to work in the darkroom, it permitted Eliot to work every day and Janet to handle everything else. So, it really was a wonderful friendship that they formed and a wonderful relationship. And, the last project of Eliot's life was a project that Janet and Eliot worked on together and meant so much to both of them. Eliot's son Jonathan gave Eliot a gift of a book called Chaos. It was a book written by James Glick. And I don't know if many of you might have known it, but it was very popular. And Eliot had already been stricken with ALS. He didn't have use of his body, but his mind was as sharp as it always was. And after reading that book, he made a comment to Janet that he said the theories and thoughts in this of chaos theory is kind of precisely what he had been photographing his whole life. He felt he'd been trying to photograph these concepts of the natural world exactly as they were being, presented by James Glick in this book. Well, one thing led to another, and Janet called James Glick, and not strangely, James Glick was very aware of who Eliot Porter was, knew of his work, knew of his reputation, and Janet proposed that he come out for a visit and they consider working on a book together. And for the next year or so, Janet and Eliot spent all their time going through all those boxes and selecting those images that Eliot felt represented this notion of chaos theory within his work. So they spent that year going through his prints one by one, looking at everything. And then, finally in 1990, right, kind of close before Eliot passed, this book was published. Janet compiled and edited it. Eliot really kind of got to revisit his life's work. It was an incredible project for the two of them to do. And in a way, it put a cap on this notion, as I started this talk with, but this notion of having a life that was both in life of art and science. And, looking at these places where they intersect, again, Eliot kind of personifies this life of being not just this amazing fine artist, but also being incredibly aware and incredibly educated about the scientific aspects of our life. And I'll end this talk with this quote. It's a favorite of Janet's and mine, but it's not about just science and art, but it's about love. It's about emotion. And the idea that both the scientist and the artist need to be driven by this sense of passion. And without love and without emotion, it's very hard to create either a scientific work or an artistic work that is meaningful. And that's kind of our driving force. And I think it's important that we don't forget that love is the driving force behind our lives and the work that we do. Thank you for joining me today and recreating this talk. I really don't know if talking to a screen is very different than talking to an auditorium filled with people. It's a little weird. It's, I don't know. I have no idea, but I don't know if you give me some feedback on this. There's actually a similar talk I have about Beaumont and visiting his studio. Maybe if this kind of works, I'll try to do that one too. I'm sorry for the length of it, but this is about how long it takes. Thank you for bearing with me today. Please visit us at photographydealers.com. Look at Scheinbaum and Russick on YouTube. Take a look at our blogs. Take a look at our website. And please stay safe, and please stay well, and please stay productive.